I watched the clock outrun the trains, and the timetable refused to yield. My orders assumed clear lines and spare hours, but the rails were already full. Each delay I hid kept the system moving and pushed the reckoning further away. When the paper still said success, I knew the cost was only being deferred. In June 1941, as Europe entered the third summer of war, the eastern rail corridors of occupied Poland carried a burden unlike any they had known before. The German military was preparing for a vast offensive against the Soviet Union. The operational situation required the movement of men, fuel, ammunition, food, bridging equipment, and repair materials across hundreds of kilometers, all of it timed to rigid schedules drafted months earlier. Rail transport stood at the center of these plans. Roads were inadequate for sustained supply, and motor transport was already stretched by maintenance demands and fuel consumption. The railway, by contrast, appeared predictable on paper. The location was the rail junction near Brest-Litovsk, a long-established hub where lines from Berlin, Warsaw, and the interior of occupied territories converged before crossing toward the Soviet border. The junction had been expanded under military administration. Sidings were lengthened, platforms reinforced, and additional signaling staff assigned. Official documents referred to the junction as a throughput node, a technical term meant to reduce a complex human system to a calculable function. On the ground, the work was carried out by railwaymen, whose routines had changed little in outward form, but whose margins for error had narrowed to almost nothing. Among them was a senior dispatcher assigned to the junction's timetable coordination office. His responsibility was not the physical movement of trains, but the sequencing of their passage, ensuring that troop transports, fuel tankers, and supply wagons entered and exited the junction in the order prescribed by higher command. The task required constant reference to printed schedules, telegraph messages, and handwritten amendments issued by transport authorities. Each morning began the same way. Before the first eastbound military trains arrived, the dispatcher reviewed the overnight reports. These listed arrivals delayed by mechanical faults, wagons removed for inspection, and locomotives reassigned due to shortages. None of these items were unusual. Railways had always been subject to such variations. What had changed was the tolerance allowed for them. The new schedules assumed uninterrupted flow. Buffer times that once absorbed minor delays had been removed to increase capacity. The dispatcher's office was a narrow room overlooking the fan of tracks spreading eastward. A wall clock marked railway time, synchronized with stations across the network. A second clock, set slightly fast, reflected the military preference for preempting delay. The desk held stacks of printed timetables stamped with security markings. Each timetable was a promise that if trains departed and arrived as ordered, entire formations would be supplied without interruption. In the first days of June, the dispatcher noticed a pattern that did not yet appear in official summaries. Eastbound trains were arriving on schedule, but departing several minutes late. The causes were small and varied. A brake inspection took longer than planned. A shunting locomotive was unavailable for 10 minutes. A priority troop train was routed through unexpectedly, forcing a supply train to wait. Individually, these delays were insignificant. Collectively, they created compression within the junction. The schedules did not account for compression. They assumed separation. Each train was allotted a precise window. When one slipped, it intruded on the next. The dispatcher recorded the delays carefully, annotating the margins of the timetable with pencil marks. The annotations accumulated faster than he could transcribe them into reports. Higher authorities expected conformity to plan. The doctrine governing transport coordination emphasized discipline and adherence to timetable. Deviations were treated as failures of execution, rather than indicators of flawed assumptions. When the dispatcher submitted his weekly report, noting an increase in minor delays, the response from the Regional Rail Directorate was brief. Capacity utilization was to be maintained. No adjustment to scheduled throughput was authorized. The operational situation intensified as the planned date of the offensive approached. Additional trains were added to the network. Some carried bridging equipment for river crossings. Others carried ammunition reserves, intended to sustain forward units during the opening weeks. These trains were often assembled hastily, their wagons drawn from different depots, their documentation incomplete. Each irregularity increased handling time at junctions. At Brest-Litovsk, the dispatcher's routine expanded. He began arriving earlier and leaving later, attempting to reconcile the official timetable with the actual flow of traffic. Telegraph lines crackled with messages from upstream stations reporting late departures. Downstream stations requested estimated arrival times that the dispatcher could no longer provide with confidence. The system relied on predictability, and predictability was eroding. The rail infrastructure itself imposed constraints that the schedules did not reflect. Tracks required regular maintenance, especially under heavy axle loads. Switches failed more frequently when operated continuously. Coal supplies for locomotives fluctuated, affecting engine availability. None of these factors were new to railwaymen, but the planning documents treated them as constants rather than variables. The dispatcher observed that the accumulation of small delays produced secondary effects. Trains held briefly at the junction occupied tracks needed by others. Locomotives waiting for clearance consumed coal while idle. Crews reached the limits of their permitted duty hours, requiring relief crews that were not always available. Each adjustment introduced further delay. By mid-June, the dispatcher had begun to alter the sequence of departures informally. When two trains arrived simultaneously, he sometimes allowed the one with the least urgent cargo to wait, even if the timetable dictated otherwise. These decisions were minor and temporary, made to prevent complete blockage of the junction. They were not authorized, and they were not recorded as such. In reports, departures still appeared nominally on schedule, their delays absorbed into generalized categories. The system's official indicators remained within acceptable ranges. Aggregate throughput figures showed that the junction was processing the required number of trains per day. What the figures did not show was the narrowing margin by which this was achieved. The dispatcher was aware that the junction was operating without reserve. Any significant disruption, a derailment, a locomotive failure, a signaling fault, would have consequences far beyond the local area. Signs of strain appeared in the behavior of the network. Requests for priority routing increased. Units in staging areas demanded fuel and ammunition deliveries at specific times to meet operational orders. The rail administration responded by issuing additional priority classifications, effectively elevating more trains without reducing overall volume. The result was a hierarchy with too many items at the top. The dispatcher attempted to communicate these concerns through established channels. In one memorandum, he noted that the concentration of departures in the early morning hours created congestion that could not be resolved by discipline alone. The memorandum was acknowledged, but not acted upon. The prevailing belief was that any shortfall resulted from insufficient enforcement of procedures rather than structural limits. As the days passed, the dispatcher's annotations filled entire pages. He began keeping a separate notebook to track recurring issues. One entry noted that 3 eastbound fuel trains had departed over 20 minutes late due to lack of available locomotives. Another recorded that a troop train had occupied a mainline track for an extended inspection, delaying 2 supply trains behind it. These observations were factual and unemotional, consistent with railway reporting practice. The operational problem was not yet a crisis. Trains were still moving. Supplies were still arriving at forward depots. The timetable, though increasingly inaccurate, remained the reference point for all decisions. The dispatcher continued his routine, adjusting where possible, documenting where necessary, and awaiting instructions that did not come. At the end of the third week of June, the dispatcher reviewed the next cycle of schedules delivered from headquarters. They showed an increase in planned throughput, coinciding with the commencement of operations. No allowance had been made for the delays already observed. The paper assumed a level of performance that the network had not demonstrated, even under peacetime conditions. The dispatcher placed the new schedules alongside his annotated copies from the previous weeks. The discrepancy between planned and actual movement was visible without calculation. He did not yet know how this discrepancy would manifest in the weeks ahead. He only knew that the system was being asked to perform beyond its proven limits, and that the margin for absorbing error had effectively disappeared. The evening shift began, and the dispatcher returned to the window overlooking the tracks. Trains continued to arrive, brakes hissing, couplings clanking, crews awaiting clearance. The clock on the wall advanced steadily. The timetable, precise and confident, lay open on the desk, increasingly detached from the reality outside. By the final days of June 1941, the Eastern Rail Network had entered a phase where deviation from schedule was no longer incidental, but systemic. The opening of the offensive against the Soviet Union triggered an immediate surge in demand. Frontline units advanced faster in some sectors than anticipated, slower in others, creating uneven consumption of supplies. Rail schedules, however, had been finalized weeks earlier and were built around fixed assumptions of distance, tempo, and consumption. At the Brest-Litovsk junction, the dispatcher began each shift with a backlog. Trains that should have cleared the junction overnight were still occupying sidings at dawn. Others arrived without advance notice, rerouted from damaged lines further east or delayed by congestion at upstream yards. The dispatcher's role expanded from sequencing movements to preventing paralysis. The distinction mattered. Sequencing assumed choice. Prevention of paralysis assumed constraint. The first repeated failures appeared in fuel distribution. Tanker trains were scheduled to arrive at forward depots within narrow time windows aligned with unit movement plans. When a tanker arrived late, the depot could not compensate by drawing from local reserves. Storage facilities near the front were deliberately kept minimal to reduce vulnerability. As a result, even short delays forced units to ration or halt movements temporarily. Reports from depots filtered back through the transport command. They did not identify rail scheduling as the cause. Instead, they cited unexpected consumption or temporary handling issues. The language reflected doctrine. The plan was assumed sound. Discrepancies were attributed to execution at the margins. No directive was issued to reduce rail volume or adjust timetables. At the junction, the dispatcher observed that priority classifications had lost practical meaning. Nearly every train now carried some form of critical cargo. Ammunition for artillery units, fuel for armored formations, food for infantry divisions, medical supplies for casualty stations, all were designated urgent. When everything held priority, the dispatcher was forced to make decisions that the system officially denied existed. These decisions were constrained by physical reality. The junction had a finite number of tracks and switches. Trains could not pass through simultaneously beyond a certain limit. When two high-priority trains arrived at once, one had to wait. The dispatcher often chose based on the likelihood of downstream congestion rather than the printed priority code. This approach reduced immediate blockage, but diverged further from the official timetable. The escalation became visible in locomotive utilization. Engines scheduled for return westward were delayed at eastern depots, waiting for unloading or reassignment. This reduced the pool available for eastbound trains, creating a feedback loop. Fewer locomotives led to delayed departures, which in turn extended locomotive idle time at congested nodes. Maintenance intervals were shortened or deferred, increasing the risk of mechanical failure. Mechanical failures did occur. In early July, a freight locomotive stalled on a gradient east of the junction, blocking a main line for several hours. The incident was resolved without dramatic damage, but its effects rippled backward through the network. Trains were held at upstream stations, crews exceeded duty limits, and schedules were rewritten by necessity rather than design. The dispatcher received a flood of messages, each requesting revised estimates that could not be reliably given. Official doctrine emphasized redundancy through volume. If one train failed, another would compensate. This assumption depended on spare capacity. By July, spare capacity no longer existed. Additional trains added to compensate for earlier delays only increased congestion. The system responded to stress by adding load rather than shedding it. The dispatcher's reports grew longer and more detailed. He documented instances where 3 or more trains, scheduled within the same hour, arrived simultaneously, forcing extended holding patterns. He noted that sidings designed for temporary storage were now occupied continuously, preventing their use for emergency diversions. These reports were transmitted upward, but received little response beyond acknowledgement. The regional transport headquarters issued reminders stressing adherence to timetable discipline. Dispatchers were instructed to avoid unauthorized resequencing. The instruction reflected concern about loss of centralized control. It did not address the practical impossibility of executing the timetable as written. At the junction, adherence to timetable without resequencing would have resulted in gridlock. Losses began to accumulate quietly. Perishable supplies spoiled when delayed. Ammunition trains held too long at exposed sidings were damaged by air attack, not because they were targeted deliberately, but because congestion increased their dwell time in vulnerable areas. Each loss was recorded as an isolated incident. The cumulative effect was not assessed in real time. Tension grew between rail personnel and military liaison officers stationed at the junction. Liaison officers represented the operational commands whose units awaited supplies. They pressed for immediate movement of specific trains, often citing orders from higher authority. The dispatcher could not comply with all such requests simultaneously. Conversations remained formal but strained. Responsibility was diffuse, accountability unclear. The dispatcher's informal adjustments became more frequent. He began to anticipate failures rather than react to them. When he knew a downstream line was congested, he delayed departures preemptively, even if the timetable allowed immediate movement. These decisions reduced the risk of complete blockage, but further distorted the planned sequence. On paper, the timetable remained intact. In practice, it had become aspirational. By mid-July, the discrepancy between reported throughput and actual effectiveness widened. The junction processed a similar number of trains as scheduled, but arrival times at depots varied widely. Units received supplies in bursts rather than steady flow. This irregularity complicated planning at every level. Operational commanders adjusted movements to available fuel rather than planned objectives, though such adjustments were rarely attributed to rail delays in official reports. The dispatcher observed that communication itself was degrading. Telegraph lines were overloaded. Messages were abbreviated or delayed. Assumptions replaced confirmations. A train reported as departed was assumed to arrive within a standard window, even when conditions suggested otherwise. When it did not, the delay was discovered only after downstream effects appeared. The transport system's doctrine did not include mechanisms for self-correction under sustained overload. There was no formal process to reduce demand or reallocate capacity dynamically. Adjustments required authorization from distant headquarters, which relied on aggregated reports that masked local strain. The dispatcher's detailed observations did not translate into strategic adjustment. One evening, reviewing the next day's schedule, the dispatcher noted that the planned sequence left no gap larger than 5 minutes between eastbound departures for a 12-hour period. Any delay would cascade immediately. He annotated the schedule with potential conflict points, marking where simultaneous arrivals were likely. These markings were for his own use. They had no place in official documentation. The early signs of failure were now unmistakable at the junction level. They were less visible at higher levels, where success was measured by totals rather than continuity. The rail network continued to function, but only through constant improvisation by individuals operating beyond formal authority. The system's reliance on timetables persisted, even as reality diverged further each day. At the close of his shift, the dispatcher handed over to his replacement, briefing him on the most critical congestion points. The briefing included verbal warnings that did not appear in written orders. Outside, trains continued to queue, their schedules increasingly theoretical. The gap between planning and execution had widened into a structural fault, though it had not yet been acknowledged as such. By late July 1941, the rail transport system supporting operations in the East had reached a point where continuity depended less on doctrine and more on individual judgment, exercised quietly at junctions and yards. The Brest-Litovsk node remained central, but the pressures bearing down on it were no longer unique. Similar reports emerged from other crossings and transfer points, though they were not consolidated into a unified assessment. Each junction appeared, in isolation, to be coping. The dispatcher at Brest-Litovsk recognized that the character of his work had changed. Earlier in the month, adjustments had been reactive, responses to late arrivals or blocked tracks. Now they were anticipatory. He no longer relied on the timetable as a sequence to be followed, but as a reference against which probable conflicts could be predicted. This shift was not formalized. It existed only in his working habits and in the pencil marks that covered his schedules. The turning point came during a period of intensified movement, following reports from the front requesting accelerated delivery of fuel and ammunition. These requests were issued as priorities, appended to existing schedules rather than replacing them. The effect was cumulative. On a single morning, the dispatcher received notice of 4 eastbound trains carrying fuel, all designated with the highest urgency, all scheduled to pass through the junction within a 90-minute window. Under the written rules, the trains were to be handled strictly in order of arrival and classification. In practice, adhering to this sequence would have blocked the junction. The dispatcher reviewed downstream reports and noted that one of the fuel trains was bound for a depot already congested, its unloading delayed by shortages of handling crews. Sending that train forward immediately would have resulted in it standing idle on the main line. After brief consideration, the dispatcher authorized a deviation. He held the congested train on a siding and allowed another fuel train, bound for a less constrained depot, to depart first. The decision was logical from an operational standpoint, but it lacked formal approval. No directive covered such a choice. It was an unofficial adjustment, made to preserve overall flow rather than comply with a specific instruction. The immediate effect was positive. The departing train cleared the junction without incident. The held train remained on the siding for several hours, during which time the downstream depot cleared sufficient space to receive it. The junction avoided a blockage. The dispatcher recorded the movement as delayed due to line conditions, a broadly accepted category that attracted little scrutiny. This decision marked a change in the dispatcher's relationship to the system. Previously, he had sought to minimize divergence from the timetable. Now, he accepted divergence as necessary and focused instead on preventing cascading failure. The risk associated with this approach was not abstract. If questioned, he would have little formal justification. Responsibility for resequencing was nominally centralized. Local discretion was discouraged. As the days passed, similar decisions became routine. The dispatcher began to categorize trains not only by official priority, but by practical impact. Trains bound for already saturated depots were delayed preemptively. Those carrying mixed cargo were sometimes broken up and reassembled, despite the additional handling time, to ensure that critical items moved forward. Each action reduced immediate congestion while increasing administrative deviation. The risk became personal in subtle ways. The dispatcher's name appeared on the daily movement logs. While these logs did not detail decision rationale, patterns could be inferred. An audit might reveal repeated departures out of scheduled sequence. Such findings could be interpreted as failure to enforce discipline rather than adaptive management. The dispatcher was aware of colleagues elsewhere who had been reassigned for less. Communication with military liaison officers grew more guarded. The dispatcher no longer explained every delay in detail. Instead, he cited generalized constraints. Liaison officers continued to press for specific movements, often invoking operational urgency. The dispatcher acknowledged these requests, but balanced them against physical capacity. Tension persisted, but open confrontation was avoided. The broader system showed signs of adjustment without acknowledgement. Informal practices spread. Dispatchers at adjacent nodes began to coordinate directly, bypassing some formal channels to exchange real-time information. These exchanges improved local responsiveness, but further undermined centralized control. The official structure remained intact, but its effective operation depended increasingly on parallel, unofficial communication. The turning point was reinforced by an incident that underscored the cost of strict adherence. A troop train, designated high priority, was routed through the junction according to schedule, despite warnings that the downstream line was obstructed. The train halted beyond the junction and remained stationary for hours, occupying a critical segment of track. Supply trains queued behind it, unable to pass. The delay affected multiple depots and required extensive resequencing to resolve. In reviewing the incident, the dispatcher noted that it could have been prevented by holding the troop train briefly at the junction. Doing so would have violated the timetable, but preserved overall movement. The lesson was clear to him, though it was not codified in any directive. The system's rules, designed to ensure efficiency, could produce inefficiency when applied without discretion. From that point, the dispatcher acted with greater confidence in his informal authority. He documented conditions meticulously, creating a record that could support his decisions if challenged. He maintained outward compliance with reporting formats while using broad categories to conceal the extent of deviation. This approach balanced transparency with self-preservation. The operational environment continued to deteriorate. Rail lines extended deeper into occupied territory, increasing transit times and exposure. Repair units struggled to keep pace with wear and damage. Each additional kilometer of track increased the number of variables affecting schedules. The dispatcher's role expanded accordingly, requiring constant reassessment of assumptions that the timetable treated as fixed. The personal dimension of risk became more pronounced when an inspection team from regional headquarters announced a visit. Such inspections focused on adherence to procedure rather than outcome. In preparation, the dispatcher reviewed logs and standardized language where possible. He did not falsify records, but he ensured that deviations were framed within accepted explanations. The inspection passed without immediate consequence. Inspectors noted high utilization and commended the junction's throughput. They did not inquire deeply into sequencing decisions. The dispatcher inferred that higher authorities preferred indicators of success to detailed analysis of strain. This preference reinforced the informal adaptation. As long as trains moved, the method of movement attracted limited scrutiny. The dispatcher's unofficial decisions did not resolve the underlying problem. They mitigated its effects locally. The broader supply schedule remained misaligned with reality. Delays continued to ripple through the system, manifesting as shortages and surpluses at different points. The dispatcher understood that his actions bought time rather than corrected course. By early August, the dispatcher's working materials bore little resemblance to their original state. Timetables were layered with amendments, annotations, and cross-references. The printed plan existed beneath a palimpsest of lived experience. The system functioned in two layers. The formal schedule circulated upward, and the informal practice that sustained movement on the ground. The turning point was complete, not because the problem had been solved, but because the dispatcher had accepted a new premise. The timetable was no longer a binding script. It was a starting point, to be adjusted continuously in response to conditions. This realization carried risk, but ignoring it carried greater risk still. At the end of another extended shift, the dispatcher filed his reports and prepared for the next day's movements. Outside, the rail yard remained active, its order maintained through constant intervention. The supply schedule, though still officially intact, had become dependent on decisions made quietly, without endorsement, by individuals positioned between planning and reality. By mid-August 1941, the cumulative effects of earlier decisions and unaddressed constraints began to surface in ways that could no longer be contained at the junction level. The rail system continued to move trains eastward, but the balance between demand and capacity had shifted decisively. What had once been a matter of minutes now stretched into hours and, in some cases, days. The dispatcher at Brest-Litovsk found that his informal adjustments, effective in isolation, were increasingly constrained by consequences set in motion weeks earlier. One consequence was the depletion of rolling stock. Wagons that should have cycled back west after unloading remained scattered across forward depots. Some were held because unloading facilities were overwhelmed. Others were requisitioned temporarily for storage, their return deemed less urgent than immediate operational needs. The effect on scheduling was gradual but severe. Eastbound trains could be planned only if sufficient wagons were available to assemble them. The dispatcher began receiving notices of scheduled trains canceled or reduced in length due to shortages. These reductions were not reflected consistently in higher-level planning documents. Headquarters continued to issue supply requirements based on assumed train capacities. When fewer wagons arrived, the discrepancy appeared downstream as shortages rather than upstream as transport failure. The rail network absorbed responsibility silently. Authority responded by tightening control. New directives emphasized reporting accuracy and warned against unauthorized deviations. Dispatchers were instructed to adhere more closely to approved sequences and to justify delays in greater detail. The intent was to reassert centralized management. The effect was to narrow the already limited space for adaptation. At the junction, this pushback manifested as increased scrutiny. Liaison officers began requesting written explanations for delays that previously would have passed without comment. The dispatcher spent more time drafting justifications, using established terminology to describe conditions that no longer fit neatly into prescribed categories. Each explanation consumed time and attention that might otherwise have been spent managing traffic. The stakes peaked quietly rather than dramatically. A prolonged congestion episode in late August brought the system close to visible failure. Several ammunition trains destined for different sectors arrived within a compressed window after delays upstream. Simultaneously, a bridge repair east of the junction reduced line capacity without immediate notice. The dispatcher was faced with a choice: follow the timetable and allow trains to proceed into a bottleneck, or hold them at the junction, creating visible backlog. Holding the trains would expose congestion locally, drawing attention from inspectors and commanders. Sending them forward would disperse congestion, but risk immobilizing trains on open lines, where recovery would be slower and losses more likely. The dispatcher chose to hold 2 of the trains, despite their priority classification, and rerouted the third through an alternate line with limited capacity. The decision prevented a mainline blockage, but resulted in a yard filled beyond its intended capacity. Trains occupied sidings reserved for emergency use. Switching operations slowed. Crews waited for instructions. The congestion was visible and undeniable. Reports were filed upward, noting exceptional accumulation. The response from authority was immediate. An officer from the Transport Command arrived to assess the situation. His focus was procedural. He questioned the dispatcher about departure sequences and timetable compliance. The dispatcher presented his logs and explained the downstream constraints. The officer acknowledged the explanation, but reiterated the importance of adherence to orders. No clear guidance was offered on how to reconcile orders with physical limits. The inspection concluded without formal reprimand, but the message was clear. Deviation would be tolerated only insofar as it did not draw attention. The system preferred invisibility of strain over its resolution. The dispatcher returned to his duties with a narrower margin for maneuver. The consequences of earlier actions continued to unfold. Units at the front experienced irregular resupply. Some received excess ammunition they could not immediately use, while others awaited fuel deliveries delayed by congestion. Operational plans adjusted accordingly, though these adjustments were rarely attributed to rail performance in official summaries. Within the rail network, morale among personnel shifted. Crews and yard workers recognized that schedules no longer reflected achievable goals. Informal practices became normalized. The dispatcher observed that new staff adopted these practices quickly, learning from example rather than instruction. The official doctrine remained unchanged, but its practical application had evolved. The dispatcher's own position remained precarious. His effectiveness depended on balancing compliance with necessity. Each decision carried potential consequence, though consequences were rarely immediate. The lack of clear institutional response to mounting evidence of strain left responsibility diffused but personal. By early September, the system stabilized at a lower level of reliability. Trains moved, but not predictably. The timetable continued to circulate, revised but still optimistic. The dispatcher continued his work, managing flow through a combination of experience, local knowledge, and restraint. The stakes had peaked, not in catastrophe, but in the quiet normalization of operating beyond design limits. At the end of another long shift, the dispatcher updated his annotated schedules and prepared reports that framed adaptation as routine variation. Outside, the junction cleared gradually, the backlog reduced but not eliminated. The rail network endured, not because it matched its plans, but because individuals compensated for their shortcomings within the narrow space allowed by authority. By October 1941, the transport coordination system that had carried the opening months of the Eastern Campaign had settled into a condition that was neither collapse nor recovery. It functioned, but only within a narrower band of reliability than originally planned. The discrepancy between timetables and reality was no longer an anomaly discussed quietly at Junction offices. It had become an accepted, if rarely articulated, feature of operations. At Brest-Litovsk, the dispatcher's daily routine changed once more. The surge of early summer had passed, replaced by sustained, uneven demand. Train volumes remained high, but their composition shifted. Emergency resupply missions were interspersed with efforts to recover rolling stock stranded far to the east. Empty wagons moved westward in long, loosely scheduled strings, often given lower priority than new supply trains, prolonging shortages elsewhere. The dispatcher continued to work from annotated schedules. but he no longer expected the printed timetable to align with actual movement. Instead, it served as an administrative reference, necessary for reporting and accountability. Actual coordination relied on accumulated experience, knowledge of which depots could absorb delays, which lines were most fragile, and which units were likely to submit urgent requests with little notice. Institutional response remained limited. No formal revision of transport doctrine was issued to address sustained overload. Instead, adjustments appeared indirectly. Planned throughput targets were quietly reduced. Buffer times, absent in early summer, reappeared in revised schedules. These changes were not presented as corrections to flawed assumptions, but as adaptations to seasonal conditions and extended lines of communication. For the dispatcher, this shift reduced immediate pressure. The reintroduction of minimal slack made some delays manageable without constant improvisation. However, it did not erase the consequences of earlier months. Equipment wear, personnel fatigue, and rolling stock losses continued to constrain capacity. The system had absorbed strain by consuming its own reserves. Accountability for the earlier unraveling of supply schedules was diffuse. No single report captured the cumulative effect of delayed trains, informal resequencing, and hidden congestion. Each incident had been recorded, categorized, and filed, but not synthesized. The absence of a clear failure point meant there was no clear moment for institutional reckoning. The dispatcher's role gradually receded from crisis management to sustained maintenance of an imperfect system. His unofficial practices became less visible as formal schedules adjusted closer to achievable performance. What had once been deviation became, in effect, the new baseline. The gap between doctrine and practice narrowed, not because doctrine had fully adapted, but because expectations had been lowered. Inspections continued, though their tone changed. Emphasis shifted from strict timetable adherence to general continuity of movement. Reports praised resilience and flexibility without examining their sources. The dispatcher noted that the language of evaluation had evolved to match outcomes rather than intentions. In the months that followed, some of the lessons embedded in daily practice filtered upward indirectly. New training materials for transport personnel emphasized situational awareness and local coordination. These materials did not reference the summer's delays explicitly, but their content reflected experience gained under strain. The adaptation was incremental and unacknowledged. For the dispatcher himself, the aftermath was quiet. He remained at his post through the winter, managing reduced but still complex traffic under harsher conditions. His name did not appear in commendations or reprimands. His work left no singular record beyond routine logs and reports. Yet the continuity of movement through the junction owed much to decisions made without endorsement and recorded only obliquely. The broader legacy of the period lay not in dramatic breakdown, but in the recognition, largely implicit, that rigid schedules could not substitute for capacity, nor could doctrine eliminate physical limits. The rail system had not failed outright. It had revealed its constraints under pressure, and individuals had compensated where institutions could not respond quickly enough. Timetables continued to be printed, circulated, and enforced. They remained essential tools. But among those who worked the junctions and yards, they were understood differently. No longer absolute scripts, they were guides requiring interpretation. This understanding persisted long after the specific circumstances that produced it had faded from immediate memory. As autumn deepened, trains continued to pass through Brest-Litovsk, their movement steadier than before, though never as predictable as the early plans had promised. The dispatcher maintained his routine, aware that future demands would bring new discrepancies between paper and practice. The system endured through quiet adjustment rather than formal acknowledgement. The story of delayed trains unraveling a supply schedule was not preserved in a single directive or inquiry. It survived instead in altered habits, revised margins, and the cautious judgment of those tasked with coordination. Their contributions were not celebrated, but they shaped how the network functioned thereafter. If this account has value, it lies in recognizing those forms of labor that rarely appear in summaries of campaigns. The work of coordination, restraint, and adaptation, performed without recognition and often without permission, yet essential to sustaining operations under strain.